All right, let's jump right in. Today we're going to talk about a book on the soul, written all the way back in the 14th century, that somehow still manages to fascinate people and, stir up some really intense debate. This thing has been around for 700 years, but believe me, its story is far from over. And when I say it's fascinating, I mean it was a huge deal. This book, Kitāb al-Ruh, which just means the book of the soul, wasn't just popular. That's a total understatement. One scholar flat out calls it a real bestseller. I mean, its influence was massive. It shaped how millions of people have thought about the soul and the afterlife for generations. It's truly one of those rare books that basically defines an entire field of thought. But, and here's where our story really kicks off. What if this incredibly successful book isn't what it seems? Behind it all, there's this amazing scholarly detective story. What if the polished, complete book we all think we know is actually something else entirely? What if its famous author, the great Ibn al-Qayyim, never actually finished it? So here's the main theory, put forward by a scholar named Tzvi Langerman. He argues that Kitāb al-Ruh isn't really one single book, written from page one to the end. Instead, it's probably a collection, a mashup of different essays and drafts that Ibn al-Qayyim was working on. The idea is that he passed away before he could stitch them all together, edit them, and give us that one final polished masterpiece. Okay, so you're probably thinking, how could we possibly know that? Well, the biggest clue, the real smoking gun, doesn't come from some dusty old archive. Nope, it comes from inside the book itself. It's a strange little note that the author himself seems to have left behind. So get this, right there in the text of Kitāb al-Ruh, Ibn al-Qayyim mentions another project he's working on. He calls it Our Large Book on Knowing the Spirit and the Soul. And he says that in that book, he's going to lay out over 100 proofs on a certain topic. But here's the kicker. Scholars have looked everywhere, and that other book, it doesn't exist. Why not? Because those 100 proofs are right here in chapter 19 of this very book. It's like he was pulling in material from different separate projects and dropping it into this one collection that he never got around to organizing. All right, clue number 2. And this one is hiding in plain sight, the preface. Yeah, the very first pages you read in a modern copy are a total mess, historically speaking. And they're a huge piece of evidence that the book was basically left in a jumble. The problem really jumps out at you when you put the different versions side by side. The preface you'll find in pretty much any printed version today, anything after 1900, was actually written by a later editor. This editor even admits the book needs an introduction and makes this wild claim that it's the first book ever on the topic, which just isn't true. But if you go back to the earliest handwritten copies, you find a totally different intro, written by Ibn al-Qayyim himself, talking about the Quranic story of creation. It's completely different. So what does this all mean? It means that for more than 100 years, people have been opening this book and reading an introduction that the author never even wrote. After Ibn al-Qayyim died, his original opening got swapped out, maybe by a scholar named al-Baqai a century later. Then, when the book was first printed in a big way in 1900, they used that newer, non-original preface, and that just became the standard. Now, all of this historical messiness, the fact that it seems to be a collection of drafts, this whole weird preface situation, has lit a fire under a very modern debate. Some people have taken these clues and gone even further, asking, did Ibn al-Qayyim even write this book at all? And look, this isn't just some dry academic argument. It's tied to some really deep, modern-day religious disagreements. See, Ibn al-Qayyim is a massive authority figure for a lot of people, but this particular book has ideas in it that they find, well, controversial. Things like allowing prayers at grave sites or using philosophical language that makes them uncomfortable. So for some folks, the simplest way to deal with that contradiction is just to say, you know what, he didn't write it. That revered scholar of ours would never have written that. And that's why this whole thing is so fascinating. It's the perfect example of how old books aren't just dusty objects sitting on a shelf. They are living, breathing things that can become battlegrounds for today's debates about faith, authority, and what we believe. Okay, so we've talked a lot about the mystery of how this book was put together, but let's get into the good stuff, what's actually inside it. What makes it so powerful that people are still reading it and arguing about it 7 centuries later? I think the answer is in how it's structured, which is incredibly unique and just deeply human. The whole thing is built around 21 questions. That's it. It's not some dense, super academic text that's impossible to get through. It reads more like a big Q&A session with a brilliant teacher. And that format is so accessible, right? It just jumps straight into the very things we've all wondered about the soul and the afterlife. It speaks directly to our own curiosity. And you can basically group these 21 questions into 3 big chunks. The first part, which is the biggest, is super practical and personal. It asks questions like, can the spirits of the dead actually meet up? Do they know what we, the living, are doing down here? Then the book shifts gears and gets more theological, asking big stuff like, is the soul created or has it always existed? And finally, it goes full-on philosophical, trying to answer the ultimate question, what even is the soul really? At the end of the day, what makes this book so timeless is its incredible range. It can go from a really concrete question you might have standing in a cemetery, all the way to the most profound questions about what it even means to be human. It just tackles those universal questions that we all ask ourselves about life, death, and what comes next. And that, right there, is why it still hits home for so many people. So that leaves us with one last thing to chew on. This whole story of the Book of the Soul shows us that a book can be a bestseller, a cornerstone of a tradition, and a beautiful, unfinished puzzle all at the same time. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? How many other great works of history that we just take for granted are hiding their own complicated, messy, and just absolutely fascinating backstories?